A group of reckless bikers storms into a peaceful park, targeting a lone man for harassment. Little do they know, they've picked the wrong target. A retired Special Forces soldier trying to enjoy his day off. What unfolds next is a gripping tale of resilience, justice, and unexpected revelations. The morning sun painted the park in warm hues of gold and amber, its rays peeking through the thick canopy of oak and pine. Caleb sat on a weathered wooden bench, the kind that had seen countless seasons and bore the etchings of lovers' initials and amateur poetry. This spot, nestled in a quiet corner of the sprawling park, had become his sanctuary. After 2 decades in the military, the retired Special Forces operative had learned to cherish moments of stillness, the kind that soothed the soul and allowed him to reflect without the weight of his past bearing down too heavily. For Caleb, the park was more than a mere retreat. It was a symbol of renewal. Each morning, he'd lace up his running shoes and jog the winding trails, his pace steady, his breath measured. The rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his feet was his form of meditation. Today, however, was different. A faint unease lingered at the edges of his mind, a residue of instincts honed on battlefields far from home. He glanced at the families scattered across the park, their laughter and carefree chatter forming a symphony of normalcy he both envied and cherished. Across the park, the distant roar of motorcycle engines broke the tranquility. Caleb glanced up from his paperback novel, his brow furrowing. The sound grew louder, closer, until it echoed through the trees. Soon, a gang of bikers burst onto the scene, their presence as jarring as a thunderstorm on a summer afternoon. Leather jackets emblazoned with garish logos, roaring machines that spat fumes into the air, and an air of defiance that declared their disdain for authority. They were a storm brewing in an otherwise calm sky. The gang was led by a man who seemed to embody chaos. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard unkempt and streaked with gray. The others followed his lead, circling a picnic area where a few families had gathered. Laughter turned to murmurs of unease as the bikers dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Caleb observed quietly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, from the leader's swagger to the way the others glanced at him for direction. One biker, younger and cockier than the rest, spotted Caleb sitting alone. He nudged the man beside him, pointing in Caleb's direction. The leader followed the gesture, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the lone figure on the bench. Something in Caleb's demeanor, a calmness that bordered on indifference, seemed to provoke them. Perhaps it was the absence of fear, or the way he didn't avert his gaze when their eyes met. The gang sauntered over, their heavy boots echoing ominously. Caleb remained seated, his book now resting on his lap. The leader stopped a few feet away, his lips curling into a sneer. "Nice day for a stroll, isn't it?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Caleb met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "It was," he replied evenly. The leader's smile faded. He wasn't accustomed to such responses. Most people either cowered or tried to placate him. This man, however, radiated a quiet confidence that was unnerving. "You don't look like you belong here," the biker said, taking a step closer. "I could say the same about you," Caleb replied, his tone devoid of hostility. The younger biker, emboldened by his leader's proximity, stepped forward. "Got a smart mouth, huh?" he said, reaching out to shove Caleb's shoulder. It was a mistake. In one fluid motion, Caleb rose from the bench, his movements so swift and precise that they seemed almost unnatural. The biker's hand barely grazed him before Caleb had seized his wrist, twisting it in a way that made the young man cry out in pain. The gang froze, their bravado momentarily shattered. Caleb released the biker, who stumbled back, clutching his arm and glaring at him. The leader's face darkened. "Big mistake, old man," he growled. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I'm just here to enjoy the day. I suggest you do the same." The gang bristled at the implied warning. They weren't used to being challenged, let alone by someone who appeared to be an ordinary man. Yet there was something about Caleb that made them hesitate, a sense of controlled power that seemed dangerous, even lethal. The leader took a step forward, but before he could speak, a voice called out from nearby. "Hey, leave him alone." It was a young woman holding a phone, her camera pointed directly at them. She stood near a group of park visitors, all of whom were now watching intently. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. "You got lucky today," the leader said, his voice low and filled with menace. He turned to his gang and jerked his head toward their bikes. They mounted up, their engines roaring to life. As they sped away, Caleb watched them go, his face impassive but his mind already turning over the implications of what had just occurred. He sat back down, picking up his book, but the words blurred on the page. The peace of the park had been shattered, and he knew this wasn't the end. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to run from it. Caleb glanced at the woman who had recorded the confrontation, now surrounded by curious onlookers. She approached him, a mixture of admiration and apology in her expression. "Are you okay?" "That was intense," she said, her voice tinged with nervous energy. "I'm fine," Caleb replied, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his pants. "But you should be careful. Those types don't take kindly to being exposed." The woman hesitated, clutching her phone. "I just thought, well, someone had to do something." Caleb nodded, appreciating her courage but worried about the consequences. Sometimes doing something has a cost. Just be ready for it. As she walked away, Caleb's thoughts turned inward. The park, once his refuge, now felt different, tinged with the kind of tension that came from unresolved conflict. He decided to take one last walk around the trails before heading home, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his boots grounding him once again. The following day, the park was quieter than usual. The typical hum of morning joggers and children playing was subdued, replaced by a subtle tension that lingered in the air. Caleb arrived earlier than usual, his movements purposeful but unhurried. He wore his usual attire, a plain gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and sturdy boots that had seen both peace and conflict. As he walked the trails, he noticed fewer families and more whispers among those present. The confrontation from the day before had left an impression, and it was clear the bikers were on everyone's mind. Caleb's own thoughts were far from peaceful. His instincts told him the encounter wasn't over. The bikers had left too easily, their retreat marked by threats rather than true defeat. Men like that didn't let go of grudges, especially when their egos were bruised in public. The leader's words echoed in Caleb's mind, not as a warning, but as a promise. He finished his circuit of the park and settled back on his bench, the same one from the previous day. This time, he wasn't reading. His gaze swept the surroundings, scanning for anything out of place. It was a habit ingrained in him from years of service, always assessing, always prepared. His military career had taught him that danger rarely announced itself. It crept in, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. Caleb's attention was drawn to a group of teenagers gathered near the edge of the park. They were animated, their voices carrying snippets of excitement and concern. As he watched, one of them pointed toward him. A moment later, the group dispersed, leaving behind a single figure, a boy no older than 15, hesitant but determined. The boy approached Caleb slowly, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. "Excuse me," the boy said, his voice shaky but polite. "Are you the guy from yesterday? The one with the bikers?" Caleb studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's me. What's on your mind?" The boy glanced over his shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. I just wanted to say thanks. My sister was at the park yesterday, and she said you stood up to them. Not many people would have done that." Caleb gave a small, non-committal shrug. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't a choice. It's just what needs to be done. The boy hesitated, then added, I heard they're coming back. My friend's older brother hangs out with them sometimes, and he said they're planning something big. I thought you should know." Caleb's expression remained neutral, but inside, his thoughts churned. If the bikers were planning a return, it meant they hadn't taken the lesson to heart. Instead, they'd likely interpreted his restraint as weakness, a dangerous miscalculation on their part. "Thanks for letting me know," Caleb said, his tone steady. "You and your sister stay safe, all right?" The boy nodded and hurried off, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. He stayed on the bench a while longer, processing the information. The bikers were returning, and this time, it wouldn't be a simple show of bravado. They would escalate just as men like them always did. Caleb knew he needed to be ready. That afternoon, Caleb returned home and began preparing. His modest house, tucked away on a quiet suburban street, was a reflection of his no-nonsense personality. It was neat and unassuming, with minimal decoration and a functional layout. In the basement, however, was a different story. Here, Caleb's past was laid bare, a small arsenal of weapons, gear, and equipment from his years in the military. It wasn't paranoia that drove him to keep these things. It was pragmatism. The world was unpredictable, and Caleb believed in being prepared. He selected a few items with care, focusing on tools rather than weapons. His goal wasn't to wage war, but to ensure he had the means to protect himself and others. A sturdy baton, compact but effective, was slipped into his bag. A tactical flashlight with a blinding strobe feature joined it, along with a compact first aid kit. Lastly, Caleb added a small, foldable knife, not for offense but for utility. As Caleb packed, his mind wandered to his time in the military. He remembered the grueling training sessions, the endless drills that had honed his reflexes and instincts. He thought of the men and women he'd served with, the camaraderie that had made the hardships bearable. Those experiences had shaped him, turning him into a man who could face danger head-on. But they had also left scars, both visible and hidden, that he carried with him every day. By the time the sun began to set, Caleb was back at the park. He took a different route this time, avoiding the main trails in favor of the wooded areas that offered better concealment. As he moved, he noted potential vantage points and escape routes. The park was familiar territory, but he approached it now as a battlefield, his mind analyzing every detail. Near the northern edge of the park, Caleb stopped to observe. The area was quiet, the last of the evening light casting long shadows across the ground. He was about to move on when he heard it, the faint rumble of engines in the distance. It was a sound he'd become all too familiar with, and it sent a ripple of tension through his body. The bikers were coming. Caleb retreated further into the shadows, his movements silent and deliberate. He positioned himself behind a thick tree, his back against the rough bark, and waited. Minutes passed, and the sound grew louder, accompanied by the occasional shout or laugh. When the bikers finally appeared, their numbers had doubled since the previous day. From his vantage point, Caleb could see the leader at the forefront, his expression dark and determined. The gang spread out, their presence dominating the area. It was clear they weren't here for a casual visit. They were sending a message, to him and to anyone else who dared to challenge them. Caleb stayed hidden, observing their movements. They lingered near the picnic area, their loud voices disrupting the night's quiet. A few of them began vandalizing park property, kicking over trash cans and smashing bottles. The leader stood apart, scanning the surroundings with an air of impatience. "Where is he?" the leader growled, his voice carrying. "He thinks he can make a fool of us and just walk away? We're not leaving until he shows his face." Caleb felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could step forward now, confront them directly, or he could wait, gathering more information. His training urged caution, but his instincts, honed over years of making split-second decisions, told him this was a pivotal moment. Taking a slow, steady breath, Caleb prepared to act. His mind reviewed every escape route he had mapped out earlier, his fingers brushing the sturdy baton in his bag. This wasn't just about standing up to the bikers. It was about setting a tone that would ripple beyond this park into the very fabric of the community they sought to terrorize. Caleb had faced far worse than these men, and if they wanted a fight, they would get one, on his terms. Slowly, he stepped out of the shadows, his presence deliberate and unwavering, ready to confront the chaos that awaited. The faint scent of damp earth mingled with the subtle rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. Caleb stood still, his body a statue of calm yet coiled readiness, as the bikers below continued their rampage through the park. Their laughter grated against the natural serenity, but Caleb's focus was unshakable. He gripped the baton hidden in his bag and prepared himself mentally for the confrontation that loomed. But as he waited, a familiar sensation stirred within him. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline-fueled clarity of a man on the edge of action, where seconds stretched into minutes and each sound sharpened into clarity. The present blurred, and suddenly, Caleb was no longer in the park. The scenery around him dissolved into the searing heat of the desert where he had spent some of the most harrowing years of his life. He was back on patrol, a young soldier fresh out of training, the taste of dust thick in his throat. His unit had been tasked with securing a small village plagued by insurgent attacks. Caleb remembered every detail: the dry wind that chafed against his face, the faint cries of children in the distance, and the palpable tension that clung to the air. "Stay sharp," the voice of his commanding officer had barked through the comms. "They know we're here." Caleb's heart had raced as he scanned the horizon, his rifle heavy in his hands. The village, quiet and unassuming at first glance, was a labyrinth of potential threats. The narrow alleyways and crumbling walls were a sniper's paradise, and every shadow felt like an ambush waiting to spring. Caleb had always been meticulous, a trait that earned him both respect and the occasional ribbing from his squad mates. On that day, it had saved his life. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye had caught his attention. Without hesitation, he had called out a warning just as the first shot rang out. The memory of that firefight burned brightly in his mind, the deafening roar of gunfire, the shouts of his comrades, and the acrid scent of smoke mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Caleb had acted instinctively, his training taking over as he moved from cover to cover, returning fire with precision. But it wasn't the fight itself that haunted him. It was the aftermath. The insurgents had been subdued, but at a cost. 2 of his squad mates had been wounded, and one, a young man barely out of his teens, had bled out before the medevac arrived. Caleb had knelt beside him, his hands slick with blood as he tried to stop the bleeding, whispering reassurances he didn't believe. "You're going to be fine," he had said, though the hollow look in the boy's eyes told him otherwise. The weight of that loss had stayed with Caleb, a ghost that lingered in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect. He had seen death before and after that day, but something about the senselessness of it, the sheer inevitability of the young soldier's fate, had struck a chord. He couldn't silence. The sharp crack of a bottle smashing against the pavement jolted Caleb back to the present. His grip on the baton tightened as he reoriented himself, his breathing steadying as he forced the memories back into the recesses of his mind. This wasn't the desert. There were no insurgents here, only men desperate to prove their dominance in a world that no longer respected it. Yet the parallels between the two situations were undeniable. Danger was danger, no matter the setting. From his vantage point, Caleb watched as the gang leader barked orders to his men, gesturing wildly as if orchestrating a symphony of chaos. They followed with a mix of loyalty and fear, their actions brash but calculated. Caleb recognized the dynamics at play, the leader's need to maintain control, the underlings vying for favor while masking their own doubts. It reminded him of the power struggles he had witnessed overseas, where authority was often maintained through intimidation rather than respect. The gang's leader shouted something unintelligible, breaking Caleb's reverie once more. This time, he didn't allow his thoughts to drift. The present demanded his full attention. He straightened, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light cast by a flickering lamppost. The murmurs of the bikers fell silent as their eyes locked onto him, their expressions shifting from amusement to wariness. Caleb didn't speak at first. He let his presence do the talking, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to their agitation. The leader stepped forward, his grin returning as he tried to mask his unease. "Look who decided to show up," he sneered. "About time. We were starting to think you'd run off." "I don't run," Caleb said evenly, his voice carrying across the space between them. "But you might want to start." The bikers laughed, though the sound was hollow. The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, his bravado doubling down. "Big words for a guy all by himself," he said. "You think you're some kind of hero?" "No," Caleb replied, his tone steady. "I'm just someone who's had enough." The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Caleb's mind was clear, his purpose set. The flashbacks that had once been a distraction were now a source of strength, a reminder of what he was capable of. He had faced worse than this. He had survived worse than this. And tonight he would show these men that their reign of terror had come to an end. As the gang closed in, Caleb took a step forward, his posture unyielding. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the park, for the people who deserved to feel safe in their own community. And he would not back down. The silence in the park was deafening in the wake of the bikers' retreat. Caleb stood alone under the flickering lamppost, his baton hanging loosely at his side. His breath came steadily despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. The scene around him felt surreal. The once lively park now abandoned, the laughter and chatter of earlier replaced by an eerie stillness. For Caleb, the quiet after a fight was always the hardest part. It was a moment of reflection, a time when the ghosts of his past whispered the loudest. The faint sound of sirens in the distance stirred him from his thoughts. Someone must have called the authorities during the commotion. Caleb had no intention of explaining himself to the police. Not tonight. He moved swiftly, his steps light and deliberate, melting into the shadows as he navigated his way out of the park. He took a circuitous route, avoiding the main paths and any lingering eyes. His experience had taught him the importance of discretion. Some battles were best fought in silence, their victories unsung. As Caleb emerged onto a quiet street on the park's perimeter, he allowed himself a brief moment to take in his surroundings. The neighborhood was calm, the windows of the nearby houses glowing softly with the warmth of evening routines. He envied the simplicity of it. The families gathered for dinner, the children tucked into bed. It was a life he had glimpsed but never truly lived. His own existence had always been marked by conflict, by the need to protect others even at the expense of his own peace. His home was only a few blocks away, a modest house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac. The exterior was unassuming, the kind of place that didn't attract attention. Inside, however, was a different story. Caleb had spent years creating a sanctuary, a space where he could prepare for the unexpected while keeping his past at bay. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each filled with volumes on strategy, philosophy, and history. A small collection of mementos from his military service adorned one shelf, a photograph of his squad, a medal tucked into a shadow box, and a faded map of the region where he had spent most of his career. Tonight, the house felt unusually quiet. Caleb set his bag down by the door and made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid soothing the dryness in his throat. As he leaned against the counter, his mind drifted to the events of the evening. The bikers had underestimated him, but Caleb knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Men like that thrived on power and intimidation. Being challenged in front of their peers was a slight they wouldn't forget. His gaze shifted to the small workbench in the corner of the room. It was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and a few unfinished projects. Among them was a compact surveillance system he had been piecing together over the past few weeks. It wasn't paranoia that drove him. It was preparation. The world was unpredictable, and Caleb had learned to anticipate the unexpected. He decided to finish the setup tonight. If the bikers returned, he wanted to be ready. Hours passed as Caleb worked, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The hum of the tools and the occasional chirp of crickets outside were the only sounds that filled the room. By the time he finished, the surveillance system was fully operational, its cameras strategically placed to cover every angle of the property. Caleb tested the system, ensuring the feeds were clear and the motion sensors responsive. Satisfied, he finally allowed himself to rest. As he settled into the worn leather chair in his living room, a sense of unease crept over him. The bikers weren't the type to back down easily. Their retreat earlier had been tactical, a regrouping rather than a surrender. Caleb had seen it before, in the faces of adversaries who refused to accept defeat. He knew they would return, and when they did, they wouldn't come alone. The memory of the gang's leader flashed in his mind. There had been something in his eyes, a mixture of arrogance and desperation. Men like him were dangerous, not because of their strength but because of their unpredictability. They lashed out when cornered, striking without thought for the consequences. Caleb had no doubt the leader was already planning his next move. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he read the message. It was from an unknown number, the words short but chilling. "This isn't over." Caleb's grip tightened on the device as he stared at the screen. He had expected retaliation, but the directness of the threat was unusual. It suggested a level of organization that went beyond the typical posturing of street gangs. Caleb's instincts kicked in, his mind racing through the possibilities. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. The bikers wanted him to know they were coming, that they weren't afraid to escalate. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that Caleb had no intention of losing. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate as he began securing the house. The locks on the doors and windows were checked, the security system armed. Caleb retrieved a small go-bag from the closet, its contents carefully curated for emergencies. He placed it by the front door, within easy reach. Every action was precise, each step part of a routine he had perfected over years of living on the edge. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Caleb stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the soft glow. The park, his sanctuary, had been violated, its peace shattered by those who sought to spread fear. Caleb had fought to protect it, but he knew the battle was far from over. The bikers would return, and when they did, they would find him ready. He lingered at the window, watching the world awaken. A jogger passed on the street below, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Life continued, oblivious to the battle brewing beneath the surface. For Caleb, this contrast was a reminder of why he fought. It wasn't for glory or recognition, it was for moments like these, the quiet resilience of everyday life. The sound of a bird chirping nearby broke his reverie. Caleb stepped away from the window, his resolve firm. Today would be spent preparing, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. He couldn't predict the biker's next move, but he could be ready for whatever came his way. The morning sun streamed through the cracks in Caleb's blinds, painting streaks of light across the wooden floor of his living room. Despite the early hour, he was already wide awake, his body accustomed to the regimented rhythm of his military days. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, each detail sharp and vivid. The bikers' retreat had been a temporary reprieve, but the message he'd received later was proof that their fight was far from over. Caleb's first task of the day was reconnaissance. He knew the gang would likely regroup and strategize their next move, and he needed to stay a step ahead. His plan was simple but effective: gather information without being seen. He slipped on a black hoodie and jeans, outfitting himself with a small tactical bag that carried essentials: his phone, a compact pair of binoculars, and a notebook for jotting down observations. The neighborhood was still waking up as Caleb stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-covered grass. He walked with purpose, his strides measured as he made his way toward the outskirts of town where the bikers were known to congregate. Their base of operations was a rundown auto shop on the edge of an industrial park, a location that offered both seclusion and quick access to the main highway. Caleb approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows as he surveyed the area. The shop was exactly as he remembered it. Faded paint peeling from the walls, a rusting sign barely legible above the entrance, and a handful of motorcycles parked haphazardly out front. The biker's presence was unmistakable. Even from a distance, Caleb could hear the low hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. He positioned himself behind a stack of discarded pallets across the street, using his binoculars to get a closer look. The leader was easy to spot, his towering frame and unmistakable swagger setting him apart from the others. He was speaking to a smaller group, his gestures animated as he outlined their next steps. Caleb couldn't hear their words, but the intensity on their faces was enough to tell him they were plotting something significant. As Caleb observed, he made notes in his notebook, detailing their numbers, the layout of the shop, and any potential weak points. His military training had taught him the importance of preparation, and he treated this task with the same diligence he would have in the field. Every detail mattered. Even the smallest piece of information could prove invaluable later. After an hour of observation, Caleb decided he had seen enough. He slipped away as quietly as he had arrived, retracing his steps back to the safety of his home. Once inside, he spread his notes across the dining table, reviewing them carefully. Patterns began to emerge as he connected the dots, his mind working quickly to piece together the bikers' likely strategy. Their numbers were larger than he had anticipated. The group he had confronted in the park had been only a fraction of their total force. This revelation didn't surprise Caleb, but it reinforced the need for caution. The bikers were organized, more so than he had initially given them credit for, and their leader was clearly experienced in rallying his men. Caleb spent the rest of the morning refining his plans. He mapped out possible scenarios, each one accounting for the bikers' potential moves. His preparations extended beyond his home. He revisited the park later in the afternoon, checking the areas he had mentally marked as defensible positions. The park held a deeper significance for him now, not just as a place of solace but as a battleground he was determined to defend. While walking the park's perimeter, Caleb noticed something unusual. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, was standing near the playground, her eyes scanning the area nervously. She held a phone in one hand, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her jacket. Something about her demeanor caught Caleb's attention. She seemed out of place, her unease palpable even from a distance. Caleb approached her cautiously, his movements measured to avoid startling her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you looking for someone?" The woman jumped slightly, her eyes darting to Caleb before quickly glancing away. I'm fine," she stammered, her tone unconvincing. "Just waiting for a friend." Caleb studied her for a moment, his instincts telling him there was more to her presence than she was letting on. "This park hasn't been the safest place lately," he said. "If you're in trouble, it's better to speak up." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her phone. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "You're right," she admitted. I'm looking for my brother. He's gotten mixed up with the wrong people, and I think they were here last night. Someone said there was a fight." Caleb's interest piqued. "What's his name?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Daniel," she replied. "He's been hanging out with this biker gang. I've been trying to get him away from them, but—" Her voice trailed off, a mixture of frustration and sadness in her expression. Caleb nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "This gang isn't just trouble. They're dangerous. Let me help you find your brother." The woman hesitated again, clearly torn between her desperation and her mistrust. Eventually she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly, "but only if you promise not to hurt him. He's not a bad person. He's just lost. I understand, Caleb assured her. Let's start with what you know. The two spent the next hour piecing together what little information she had. Her brother had been drawn into the gang through a mutual friend, a man she described as manipulative and aggressive. Caleb recognized the type immediately, the kind of person who preyed on vulnerability to build loyalty through fear. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set. Caleb escorted the woman to her car, ensuring she left the park safely before heading home. As he walked, his mind raced with the implications of their conversation. The bikers were more than just a nuisance. They were a network, their influence extending further than he had anticipated. Back at his house, Caleb added the new information to his notes, cross-referencing details with what he had observed earlier. The bikers weren't just a gang. They were a growing threat to the community. This realization solidified his resolve. The fight ahead wasn't just about defending the park. It was about dismantling a system of fear and control. As night fell, Caleb prepared himself for what was to come. He knew the bikers wouldn't wait long to make their next move, but neither would he. The moon rose high in the sky as Caleb sat by his window, the faint hum of the surveillance system providing a backdrop to his thoughts. He felt the weight of the night ahead but knew that the steps he had taken earlier in the day had set the foundation for his next move. As his gaze shifted toward the darkened street, a quiet determination settled in his chest. The battle was brewing, and Caleb was ready. The sound of the surveillance system's low hum filled Caleb's home as the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds. He had spent the night reviewing footage, piecing together the information he had gathered from his earlier reconnaissance. The bikers weren't just a threat to the park, they represented a systemic problem, a gang with roots that spread beyond the town's boundaries. Caleb had seen this kind of organization before, and he knew the stakes were high. His next step required precision and timing. He needed to act before the bikers made their next move, but doing so without tipping them off would be a challenge. The park and its surrounding community couldn't handle another night of chaos, and Caleb's instincts told him the bikers were planning something bigger. After a quick breakfast of black coffee and toast, Caleb reviewed his notes once more. The leader of the gang, a man the others called Tank, was the linchpin. His presence at the auto shop wasn't just about managing operations, it was about consolidating power. If Caleb could dismantle Tank's authority, the gang's cohesion would begin to crumble. The day passed in a blur as Caleb prepared. His training kicked in, his movements deliberate as he organized his gear. He packed a bag with essentials: tactical gloves, a flashlight, zip ties, and a first aid kit. The baton he had used the night before was replaced with a sturdier collapsible model, one he had kept from his military days. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore, it was about neutralizing a threat. As dusk settled over the town, Caleb set out. The auto shop was his destination, but this time he wouldn't be observing from a distance. He planned to infiltrate the building, gather intel, and leave without being detected. It was a risky move, but one he deemed necessary. Knowledge was power, and the more he understood about the bikers' operations, the better equipped he would be to dismantle them. The industrial park was eerily quiet as Caleb approached, the faint sound of crickets punctuating the stillness. He moved with practiced ease, his steps silent as he navigated the shadows. The auto shop loomed ahead, its broken sign creaking softly in the night breeze. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He circled the building, noting the positions of the parked motorcycles and the dim glow of light spilling from the windows. The bikers were inside, their voices carrying faintly through the night air. Caleb found a side entrance, the door partially ajar. It was a careless mistake, one that worked in his favor. He slipped inside, the interior of the shop bathed in a faint orange glow from the overhead lights. The space was cluttered with tools, engine parts, and stacks of old tires. Caleb moved carefully, his eyes scanning for anything of interest. He spotted a corkboard on the far wall, its surface covered in photographs, maps, and scribbled notes. It was exactly what he was looking for. Approaching the board, Caleb's gaze darted over the details. The maps marked routes that stretched beyond the town, connecting to other known gang territories. The photographs showed members of the gang, their faces stern and intimidating. One picture in particular caught his attention. It was of Daniel, the young man the woman in the park had been searching for. He looked out of place, his expression one of uncertainty rather than defiance. Caleb took out his phone, snapping pictures of the board before turning his attention to a nearby desk. Papers and folders were scattered across its surface, many of them detailing shipments and financial transactions. The bikers weren't just a gang. They were running an operation, one that involved smuggling and extortion. Caleb's suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't just about territory. It was about money and power. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted Caleb from his thoughts. He quickly pocketed his phone and retreated into the shadows, his breathing steady as he pressed himself against the wall. Two bikers entered the room, their voices low but tense. "I'm telling you, Tank's losing it," one of them said. "Last night was a disaster. He's going to get us all killed." "Shut up," the other hissed. "You think you can do better? He'll squash you like a bug if he hears you talking like that." Their conversation confirmed Caleb's earlier assessment. There was dissent within the gang. Tank's leadership was under scrutiny, and Caleb could use that to his advantage. The bikers lingered for a moment before leaving the room, their voices fading as they moved further into the building. Caleb took the opportunity to slip back out the way he came, his heart racing as he emerged into the cool night air. He made his way back to his house, the weight of the night's discoveries heavy on his mind. The gang was more dangerous than he had anticipated, but their vulnerabilities were becoming clearer. Back at home, Caleb uploaded the photographs he had taken to his laptop, organizing the information into a coherent plan. The routes, the finances, the internal dissent. It all painted a picture of a group on the verge of implosion. All it needed was a push. As he sat back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at him, Caleb allowed himself a moment of reflection. This fight wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about the community, the people who deserved to live without fear. It was about Daniel and others like him, who had been pulled into a world they didn't belong to. And it was about Caleb himself, a man seeking redemption through action. The hours ticked by as Caleb worked tirelessly, his laptop's screen glowing in the dimly lit room. The details of the bikers' operation began to take on a life of their own, every piece of information leading him closer to understanding their network. Caleb knew the battle ahead would test him in ways he hadn't faced in years, but he was ready. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Caleb leaned back in his chair. His resolve was set. The bikers had made a mistake. They had underestimated the resolve of a man who had spent his life dismantling chaos. And for that, they would pay. Caleb woke to the rhythmic chirping of birds outside his window, a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled night he had endured. The morning was calm, but Caleb knew better than to be lulled into complacency. Every quiet moment was merely the calm before the storm, and he had no intention of being caught off guard. His first task was to solidify the plans he had made overnight. The bikers' vulnerabilities were clear, and their dissent could be used to his advantage. But Caleb wasn't naive. He understood that discontent within their ranks didn't make them any less dangerous. If anything, it made them unpredictable. After a quick shower and a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Caleb returned to his laptop. The photographs he had taken at the auto shop were spread across his screen, each one offering a piece of the puzzle. Routes, faces, shipments, every detail mattered. Caleb's eyes lingered on the image of Daniel, the young man who had unwittingly become a pawn in the gang's operations. The uncertainty in his expression was haunting, a reminder of the lives at stake. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Caleb poured himself a second cup of coffee, his mind racing with possibilities. The evidence he had gathered so far was strong, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. Something undeniable that would dismantle the gang's operations and protect the people caught in their web. His gaze fell on the small notepad sitting next to his laptop. It was filled with hastily scrawled notes from the night before, a roadmap of his plan. "All right," Caleb muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. "Let's get this right." He glanced again at Daniel's photo. "If you're out there, kid, I'll find you. You didn't sign up for this." Caleb's thoughts wandered briefly to a memory that had been haunting him recently. It was from his time overseas, a mission gone wrong. The face of a young boy, no older than 10, flashed through his mind. The raid had gone sideways when a civilian vehicle veered into the hot zone, and the ensuing chaos left no room for careful judgment. Caleb had tried to shield the boy, pulling him away from the fray, but he was too late. The explosion was instantaneous, the aftermath devastating. He could still feel the weight of the boy's lifeless body in his arms, the helpless screams of a mother who would never forgive him. The flashback didn't end there. Caleb remembered the debriefing afterward, the sterile room filled with the cold gaze of superiors who labeled the tragedy as collateral damage. It had been his first real lesson in how systems failed the innocent. That day had changed him, forging a determination to act decisively when others hesitated. "Not this time," Caleb said quietly, his voice firm. "Not if I can help it." With renewed determination, Caleb packed a small bag with essentials, double-checked his surveillance equipment, and slipped out the door. The night was heavy with the kind of stillness that Caleb had learned to distrust. Every noise outside his window, every rustle of leaves in the yard felt amplified. He sat at his dining table surrounded by maps, photos, and handwritten notes, the organized chaos of his preparations. The earlier message from the bikers, "Leave it alone, or there will be consequences," still flashed in his mind, more of a challenge than a deterrent. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the corkboard he had set up against the far wall. It was a collage of connections, faces, and routes, a tactical analysis of the gang's operations. At the center of it was Tank, his towering figure dominating the photographs taken during Caleb's surveillance. Around him, a web of smaller players, locations, and known associates. For a moment, Caleb allowed himself a flicker of doubt. He had been out of the game for years now. Was he still capable of dismantling an organization this entrenched? The thought passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar resolve that had carried him through countless missions. The first step was to gather intel on their next shipment. Caleb suspected the bikers weren't operating alone. Their supply chain was too efficient, their movements too deliberate. There had to be a higher player involved, someone pulling strings from a safe distance. His next target wasn't Tank, but the network itself. He decided to visit the industrial district on the edge of town. The auto shop was part of a larger compound, a set of warehouses that had been abandoned years ago when the local economy collapsed. Now, they were a perfect front for the bikers' operations. Caleb had spotted movement there during his previous surveillance, but he hadn't risked venturing too close. Tonight, he would. Caleb geared up meticulously. His collapsible baton was secured to his belt, along with a flashlight, a multi-tool, and a small first aid kit. He wore dark, nondescript clothing, blending into the shadows. As he locked his door behind him, a familiar calm settled over him. This wasn't the nervous anticipation of a rookie. This was the steady focus of a man who had been trained to survive. The industrial district was eerily quiet as Caleb approached, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty streets. He kept to the edges, moving silently through alleys and side roads. When he reached the warehouses, he paused to survey the area. A single motorcycle was parked outside the main building, its chrome gleaming under the faint moonlight. The muffled sound of voices drifted from inside. Caleb crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, his eyes scanning for security measures. A camera was mounted near the entrance, its lens panning lazily back and forth. He waited for the right moment. then moved swiftly, staying in its blind spots until he reached the side of the building. The window above him was open, a careless oversight that Caleb wouldn't have expected from a group this organized. He pulled himself up silently, his movements deliberate. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Caleb slipped into the shadows, his eyes adjusting to the low light. The bikers were gathered near the center of the room, huddled around a table strewn with maps and documents. Tank's voice boomed above the others, his tone commanding. "We stick to the plan. No deviations. This isn't just about the shipment. It's about sending a message." Caleb crept closer, keeping to the shadows. He strained to hear their conversation, every word a potential piece of the puzzle. One of the bikers, younger and visibly nervous, spoke up. "But what about the guy who's been snooping around? You think he's working with the cops?" Tank's laugh was a low rumble. "If he is, he's playing a dangerous game. Let him come. We'll deal with him the way we deal with all threats." Caleb's jaw tightened. The bikers were aware of his presence, but they didn't seem to understand who they were dealing with. He inched closer, his gaze falling on the table. Among the documents was a shipping manifest, its columns filled with names, dates, and destinations. It was the evidence he needed. He pulled out his phone, snapping photos from his concealed position. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady. As he moved to reposition himself, his foot brushed against a loose bolt on the floor. The metallic clink echoed through the warehouse, freezing Caleb in place. Tank's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What was that? The room fell silent, the bikers reaching for weapons. Caleb pressed himself against the wall, his mind racing. He had been in worse situations before, but the odds were against him. The warehouse was a maze of machinery and debris, and his only advantage was his knowledge of how to disappear. Tank motioned for two of his men to investigate. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the space. Caleb held his breath, his fingers tightening around the baton at his side. As one of the bikers approached, Caleb sprang into action, his movements swift and calculated. The baton connected with the man's temple, dropping him silently. The second biker turned, his eyes widening in alarm, but Caleb was already on him. A sharp strike to the ribs left him gasping for air, and Caleb finished with a blow to the back of the head. Both men were unconscious before they could raise the alarm. The commotion hadn't gone unnoticed. Tank's voice boomed again. "Find him, now!" Caleb moved quickly, slipping deeper into the shadows. He needed an exit, but not before he had the shipping manifest. He reached the table, his eyes scanning for the document. It was there, partially hidden under a stack of maps. He grabbed it, folding it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Caleb's pulse quickened as he made his way toward the back of the warehouse. A fire escape led to the roof, its rusted ladder creaking under his weight. He climbed swiftly, emerging into the cool night air. Below, the bikers searched frantically, their shouts echoing through the empty streets. Caleb didn't stop to catch his breath. He moved across the rooftops, his steps deliberate and quiet. When he reached the edge of the industrial district, he descended carefully, disappearing into the shadows of the surrounding alleys. The shipping manifest was a breakthrough, but it was only the beginning. The network was larger than he had anticipated, and he would need every ounce of his training to dismantle it. As Caleb made his way back to his safe house, the weight of the night's events pressed heavily on him. He had the evidence, but the bikers were aware of him now. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. Caleb's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about taking down a gang, it was about protecting a community that deserved better. "Let them come," Caleb muttered to himself, his voice low but resolute. "I'm ready." The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Caleb's safe house, but the brightness did little to ease the tension that coiled within him. The shipping manifest sat on the table, its details burned into his mind. Names, locations, and dates scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting formed the pieces of a larger puzzle. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, but it came with a cost. The bikers were aware of him now, and their hunt had already begun. Caleb sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him as his thoughts raced. The shipping manifest confirmed his suspicions. The gang was tied to a larger network, one that stretched beyond the borders of their small town. Tank wasn't the mastermind. He was a cog in a machine. Somewhere out there, someone far more dangerous was pulling the strings. He scanned the document again, his eyes landing on a name he didn't recognize. White Raven. It appeared several times, always linked to key shipment dates. The name carried weight, an alias that hinted at a leader or organization Caleb hadn't yet encountered. His instincts told him that this was the figure he needed to uncover if he had any hope of dismantling the operation. Caleb's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from an encrypted app he used for secure communication. The sender's name was blank, but the message was clear. "They're closing in. Move fast." The text sent a chill down Caleb's spine. He didn't know who had sent it. An ally, a former contact, or perhaps someone within the gang playing a double game. Regardless, the warning was enough to push him into action. He couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. Packing his gear took less than 5 minutes. Caleb had spent years perfecting the art of traveling light. His bag contained only the essentials: his laptop, the manifest, his baton, and a change of clothes. He glanced around the room one last time, ensuring there was no trace of his presence before slipping out the back door into the alley. The streets were quiet, but Caleb felt the weight of unseen eyes. He moved quickly, his steps purposeful as he headed toward a nondescript sedan he had parked 2 blocks away. The car was unremarkable, chosen specifically for its ability to blend in. As he slid into the driver's seat, he felt the first stirrings of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Caleb didn't have a destination yet. The manifest held clues, but he needed to decipher them first. His immediate goal was to put distance between himself and the bikers. They knew his location, or at least they thought they did. By the time they closed in on the safe house, Caleb would be miles away. He drove south, the roads empty save for the occasional truck or commuter. The radio played softly in the background, a soothing contrast to the turmoil in Caleb's mind. He replayed the events of the previous night, analyzing every detail. The bikers had been sloppy, their security measures inadequate for an operation of this scale. That sloppiness could be their downfall. After an hour, Caleb pulled into a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering in the daylight. He needed to regroup, and the diner offered a momentary reprieve from the chaos. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. Caleb chose a booth in the corner, his back to the wall, with a clear view of the entrance. As he spread the manifest out on the table, he felt a flicker of unease. The name White Raven stared back at him, its significance tauntingly out of reach. He made a mental note to dig deeper into the alias later. For now, he focused on the shipment dates and destinations, tracing the gang's routes across the region. A waitress approached, her notepad in hand. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," Caleb replied, his tone polite but distant. He didn't look up, his attention fixed on the manifest. The waitress hesitated, her curiosity evident, but she didn't press. She returned moments later with a steaming cup, setting it down without a word. Caleb barely noticed, his mind consumed by the task at hand. The manifest was a treasure trove of information, but it was also incomplete. Caleb needed more. He decided to visit one of the destinations listed on the document, a warehouse in the neighboring city. If the bikers were using it as part of their supply chain, it could hold the answers he was looking for. Caleb finished his coffee, leaving a few bills on the table before slipping out of the diner. The sun had risen higher in the sky, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill in Caleb's gut. He knew the risks of what he was about to do, but he also knew there was no turning back. The drive to the warehouse took nearly 2 hours, the scenery shifting from rural fields to the sprawling outskirts of the city. Caleb kept an eye on his rearview mirror, his paranoia a constant companion. He didn't see any signs of pursuit, but he knew better than to let his guard down. When he arrived, the warehouse looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its exterior coated in grime. But Caleb's trained eye picked up subtle signs of activity: fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a faint hum of machinery coming from within. This was no ordinary derelict building. He parked a safe distance away, using a pair of binoculars to survey the area. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence, its gate secured with a heavy padlock. A guard stood near the entrance, his posture alert but relaxed. Caleb noted the details, committing them to memory as he formulated a plan. Slipping out of the car, Caleb approached the fence, keeping low to avoid detection. He found a section where the chain link had been cut and hastily repaired, a weak point he could exploit. Within minutes, he was inside the perimeter, moving silently toward the warehouse. The guard didn't see him until it was too late. Caleb's baton struck with precision, leaving the man unconscious but unharmed. Caleb dragged him into the shadows, securing his hands and feet with zip ties before continuing. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of chemicals and oil. The space was dimly lit, rows of crates stacked high against the walls. Caleb moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. He found a clipboard resting on one of the crates, its pages filled with inventory lists and shipping schedules. The names matched those on the manifest. As Caleb photographed the documents, a voice echoed from deeper within the warehouse. "Hey, you hear something?" Caleb's pulse quickened. He slipped into the shadows, his movements silent as the footsteps drew closer. His heart pounded, but his mind remained calm. He was trained for this. The bikers were closing in, but Caleb had what he needed. As he made his way toward the exit, he knew this was only the beginning. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game would become. But Caleb wasn't afraid of danger. He thrived on it. The chill of the early morning clung to Caleb as he slipped into his car, the warehouse fading into the distance in his rearview mirror. The documents he had secured felt heavier than they should, as though they carried the weight of every dangerous move he had yet to make. His mind was already spinning, analyzing the data he'd photographed: inventory lists, shipping schedules, and cryptic notes scribbled in the margins, all pointing to something far larger than the local operation he had first assumed. Caleb turned off the highway onto a quiet back road, the sound of his tires crunching against loose gravel breaking the silence. He pulled over near a cluster of trees, far enough from the road to avoid detection, and opened his laptop. Transferring the photos from his phone, he organized the data. Each name and location felt like a clue, breadcrumbs leading to a shadowy figure known only as White Raven. The alias gnawed at Caleb's thoughts. He had encountered cryptic nicknames before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a moniker. It was a mask for someone with resources, influence, and ruthlessness. The name appeared repeatedly across the documents, often tied to shipments of goods Caleb couldn't yet identify. Weapons? Drugs? Something worse? He needed answers. Caleb rubbed his temples, exhaustion tugging at the edges of his focus. His mind drifted back to the waitress at the diner, her hesitant but knowing glance as she placed the coffee on his table. Was she an unwitting observer or a potential informant? It didn't matter now. What mattered was deciphering the connections between the names and locations, forming a web Caleb could untangle. Hours passed as Caleb pieced together the fragments of the operation. The routes were strategic, crisscrossing major highways and quiet backroads, ensuring minimal risk of detection. The destinations varied, some warehouses like the one he had just infiltrated, others private airstrips or isolated properties hidden deep within forests or mountains. Each node in the network seemed to operate independently, but the manifest hinted at a single directive guiding them all. Caleb's phone buzzed, jolting him out of his concentration. The encrypted app again. This time, the message was longer. White Raven is watching. Keep moving. Southbound Route 16 isn't safe. A chill ran down Caleb's spine. Whoever was sending the messages had an uncanny awareness of his movements. Was it a warning, or was he being manipulated? Either way, he couldn't ignore the advice. Route 16 had been his planned path, but now he would need another way to reach the next destination listed in the manifest. He folded his laptop shut, his movements brisk but controlled, and started the car. The dense canopy of trees overhead cast dappled shadows on the road as he navigated away from his temporary hideout. His instincts were on high alert, every passing vehicle or flicker of movement in the tree line setting his nerves on edge. Caleb's next target was a warehouse located near a private airstrip on the outskirts of a sleepy town. According to the manifest, a significant shipment was scheduled to depart from there within the next 24 hours. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, and Caleb couldn't afford to miss it. As dusk began to fall, Caleb arrived at the outskirts of the town, its streets quiet and unassuming. He parked his car a mile from the airstrip, opting to cover the rest of the distance on foot. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, the stillness broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. Caleb moved silently, his footsteps muffled by the soft ground. The airstrip came into view, its perimeter surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond the fence, he could see the faint glow of floodlights and the silhouettes of workers moving crates onto a small cargo plane. He crouched behind a cluster of bushes, his eyes scanning for any gaps in security. The guards patrolled with a casual confidence that told Caleb they weren't expecting trouble. He noted their patterns, timing their movements as he calculated his approach. His heart pounded in his chest, the familiar thrill of the hunt sharpening his senses. When the moment was right, he slipped through the shadows, reaching the base of the fence without a sound. Caleb retrieved a small set of wire cutters from his bag, the tool glinting faintly in the moonlight. The soft snip of the wire was almost imperceptible against the hum of the airstrip. Within moments, he had created an opening large enough to slip through. He moved quickly, his body low to the ground as he advanced toward the crates stacked near the cargo plane. Each crate was marked with a series of codes and symbols that meant little to Caleb at first glance. He snapped photos of the markings, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. A faint voice reached his ears, drawing his attention to two workers engaged in conversation nearby. "White Raven said this shipment's priority. We can't screw it up," one of them said, his tone tinged with unease. Caleb's ears perked at the mention of the name. The other worker, older and more confident, laughed. "Relax. No one's getting past security. This stuff is locked tighter than a vault." The younger worker didn't respond, his apprehension evident in the way he glanced nervously around the airstrip. Caleb took the opportunity to slip closer, his movements deliberate and silent. He reached a crate that had been partially opened, its contents glinting faintly in the light. Inside were rows of small unmarked packages sealed in black plastic. Before Caleb could investigate further, the crunch of approaching footsteps forced him back into the shadows. Two guards passed by, their conversation idle, but their eyes sharp. Caleb held his breath, his body pressed against the cold metal of the crate until they moved on. Time was running out. Caleb knew he couldn't linger much longer without risking exposure. He retreated to the fence, slipping through the opening he had created and vanishing into the tree line. His mind raced as he made his way back to his car, the photographs he had taken offering more questions than answers. The network was larger and more organized than he had anticipated. White Raven's influence extended far beyond the local operation, and the stakes were rising with every move Caleb made. As he drove away from the airstrip, the weight of his mission pressed heavily on him. He couldn't stop now, not when the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. "Let's see how far your reach really goes," Caleb muttered, his voice low but resolute as he tightened his grip on the wheel. Caleb drove into the darkness, his focus honed on the road ahead and the labyrinth of thoughts twisting in his mind. The airstrip's operation had confirmed his worst fears. The network was sprawling, organized, and dangerous. White Raven wasn't just a name. It was the nucleus of an enterprise that thrived in the shadows, exploiting weak systems and unsuspecting communities. The hum of the car engine was steady, a background rhythm to Caleb's analysis. He replayed the details from the airstrip. Guards confident in their lax routines, crates filled with sealed black packages, and the palpable tension of workers who feared their unseen leader more than they valued their lives. The question that gnawed at him wasn't how he could dismantle this operation, but how far he could push before White Raven's claws reached for him. As the highway stretched endlessly, Caleb's phone buzzed from its holder on the dashboard. A new message blinked on the encrypted app. New shipment confirmed. Quarry route, 2 hours. Quarry route. Caleb's memory clicked. He'd marked that location during his research, a remote path connecting abandoned mining sites to industrial hubs. It was an ideal spot for discreet transfers, surrounded by rugged terrain that would complicate pursuit. Whoever was feeding him this information was watching the same moves Caleb was. But why? The message left Caleb unsettled. Was this informant a genuine ally or a manipulative piece of the White Raven puzzle? The timing of their warnings and tips was unnervingly precise, steering him toward key moments in the operation. Still, every lead they'd provided had been accurate so far, and Caleb couldn't afford to dismiss an opportunity to disrupt the network. Caleb shifted lanes, exiting the highway onto a dirt road that led toward the quarry. The terrain grew rougher, the car bouncing lightly as he navigated the unpaved path. The landscape changed with each passing mile, the flat expanse giving way to jagged hills and dense trees that loomed like sentinels in the dim moonlight. He parked the car near an overgrown trail, pulling his gear from the trunk. His dark clothes blended into the night, the straps of his bag snug against his back as he moved silently into the wilderness. The path to the quarry was uneven, a winding trail through rocky outcroppings and tall grass. Caleb's breathing was steady, each step deliberate as he made his approach. The quarry appeared suddenly, a vast hollow carved into the earth, its edges illuminated by the faint glow of portable floodlights. Caleb crouched low, his sharp eyes scanning the scene below. Trucks were parked near the base, their engines idling as figures moved between them. Crates were being unloaded, more of the same black-sealed packages from the airstrip. Caleb's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a transfer, it was a staging ground for a much larger operation. He pulled out his binoculars, focusing on the individuals overseeing the activity. One man stood apart from the rest, his posture commanding. Unlike the workers who moved with nervous energy, this man exuded an unsettling calm. Caleb couldn't make out his features clearly, but the aura of authority was undeniable. "Who are you?" Caleb muttered under his breath. He reached for his phone, snapping photos of the scene. Each shot captured the precision of the operation, the placement of the trucks, the guarded perimeters, the way the workers avoided eye contact with their overseer. As he documented the activity, Caleb noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The workers' movements grew sharper, their voices quieter. Something, or someone, had shifted the dynamic. Caleb adjusted his binoculars, his gaze locking onto the man who had caught his attention. A worker handed him a small device, perhaps a tablet or control panel, and the man's head tilted slightly as though scanning the surroundings. The faint crack of a branch snapped Caleb's focus. He froze, every muscle tense as his ears strained for more. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone, or something, was moving toward him. Caleb shifted his weight, easing into a defensive stance. His hand hovered near the baton strapped to his side, ready to spring into action. A figure emerged from the shadows, their silhouette barely discernible against the rugged landscape. Caleb's grip tightened, his instincts screaming caution. But as the figure stepped closer, a low voice reached him. "Don't move." Caleb didn't flinch, his mind racing as he calculated the odds. The voice was firm but not hostile, and the speaker kept their distance, their posture cautious. "You're Caleb. aren't you?" The figure continued, their words slow and deliberate. The use of his name sent a ripple of unease through Caleb. "Who's asking?" he replied, his voice calm despite the tension. "I'm the one who's been feeding you information," the figure said, stepping into the faint moonlight. They were clad in dark clothes similar to Caleb's, their face partially obscured by a scarf and cap. "And if you don't want this operation to go south, you'll trust me." Caleb's eyes narrowed, his mind a whirl of questions. Trust was a fragile concept in his world, but the figure's presence and their knowledge wasn't something he could ignore. "Start talking," he said, his voice a low growl. The figure gestured toward the quarry. "White Raven's operation runs deeper than you think. What you see here is just a piece of the puzzle. If you want to take them down, you'll need more than photos and gut instincts." Caleb studied the figure, their body language revealing no obvious signs of deceit. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, the suspicion evident in his tone. "Because I've been where you are," the figure replied, "and if you're smart, you'll let me guide you before you get yourself killed." Before Caleb could respond, the sound of engines roaring to life echoed through the quarry. The trucks were moving, the workers scattering like ants as the operation began to mobilize. Caleb glanced at the scene, his instincts urging him to act, but the figure's voice cut through his thoughts. "Not yet. Follow them. You'll find what you're looking for." Caleb hesitated, every fiber of his being resisting the idea of letting the convoy slip away. But something about the figure's demeanor, an unshakable conviction, held him back. He nodded reluctantly, stepping away from his vantage point as the figure disappeared into the shadows. The convoy's taillights glowed faintly in the distance, weaving through the winding roads ahead. Caleb kept his distance, his headlights off and his car coasting in near silence to avoid detection. The roads were narrow, hemmed in by dense forests that cast long shadows under the pale moonlight. Each curve of the road felt like a calculated risk, the fine line between remaining unseen and staying close enough to track his targets. The trucks moved in a disciplined formation, the lead vehicle setting a deliberate pace while the others followed with precision. Caleb noted the consistency of their movements, a sign that this wasn't their first covert transport. These drivers were trained, perhaps ex-military or mercenaries with enough experience to know how to avoid trouble. As he followed, Caleb's mind churned with questions. The figure at the quarry had been an unexpected twist. Their knowledge of White Raven's operation and their insistence on helping him hinted at a deeper involvement. But trust was a luxury Caleb couldn't afford, especially when his every move brought him closer to an enemy he barely understood. The road stretched on, twisting through the darkened landscape until the convoy veered off onto an unmarked dirt path. Caleb slowed, letting his car roll to a stop as he watched the trucks disappear into the trees. He couldn't risk following them in his vehicle. The sound of his engine would betray him. Instead, he grabbed his gear and slipped out into the night, his movements deliberate and silent as he approached the path on foot. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their calls and rustlings blending into a natural symphony that masked Caleb's approach. The dirt path was rough, scattered with loose stones and roots that threatened to trip him with every step. But Caleb's focus was unwavering, his body attuned to the rhythms of the forest as he moved deeper into the shadows. After what felt like hours, the trees parted to reveal a clearing bathed in the harsh glow of industrial floodlights. Caleb crouched low, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The trucks had parked in a semicircle around a massive warehouse, its corrugated metal walls gleaming under the lights. Workers moved quickly, unloading crates and securing them onto forklifts that disappeared into the warehouse's yawning entrance. Caleb adjusted his binoculars, his gaze sweeping across the operation. The workers were methodical, their movements precise as they transferred the cargo. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Caleb noted their patterns, timing the intervals between their movements as he calculated the best approach. A sudden movement drew his attention to the far side of the clearing. A black SUV rolled into view, its windows tinted and its engine a low, ominous hum. The workers seemed to stiffen as it approached, their posture straightening as though anticipating scrutiny. The SUV came to a stop and a man stepped out, his presence commanding. Caleb's breath caught as he focused on the man. Unlike the workers and guards who carried themselves with the rough edges of hired help, this man moved with the calculated precision of someone used to wielding authority. His tailored suit and polished demeanor stood in stark contrast to the gritty surroundings, and his sharp eyes scanned the clearing with an intensity that made Caleb's skin prickle. "White Raven," Caleb whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. It was a leap, but something about the man's presence and the reaction he elicited from the workers made Caleb certain. This was someone at the top, if not the mastermind himself. The man began speaking to one of the guards, his voice too low for Caleb to hear. The guard nodded quickly, his body language betraying a mix of fear and respect. Caleb snapped photos of the interaction, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Each shot felt like a step closer to unraveling the network, a tangible piece of evidence that could expose the operation. As Caleb documented the scene, his instincts screamed a warning. He ducked lower, his gaze darting toward the tree line where he spotted a shadow moving against the light. Someone was circling the perimeter, their movements deliberate. Caleb held his breath, his muscles coiled as he prepared for the possibility of discovery. The figure passed by, their attention focused inward on the clearing. Caleb exhaled slowly, his heart pounding as he adjusted his position. He couldn't afford to linger much longer. The longer he stayed, the higher the risk of being spotted. Carefully, Caleb retreated into the forest, his steps as silent as the predators that hunted these woods. He moved quickly, his mind already working through the next steps. The photographs were invaluable, but they were only a fraction of the puzzle. He needed more: names, connections, evidence that could dismantle the network and bring its leaders to justice. When Caleb reached his car, the relief was short-lived. His phone buzzed with another encrypted message. "They know you're here. Leave now." A cold wave of dread washed over him. Whoever was sending these messages had eyes everywhere, and their warnings were becoming more urgent. Caleb started the car, the engine's hum breaking the forest's stillness as he turned onto the main road. He didn't look back, his focus locked on the road ahead and the growing realization that the noose was tightening. The drive was tense, every shadow on the road feeling like a threat, every pair of headlights in the distance a potential pursuer. Caleb's grip on the wheel was tight, his jaw clenched as he pushed the car faster, putting as much distance between himself and the warehouse as possible. When he finally stopped, it was at a desolate rest area miles away from the clearing. Caleb stepped out, his legs stiff from the drive, and leaned against the car. His mind raced, the pieces of the night's events clicking together in a disjointed pattern. The man in the suit, the precision of the operation, the ominous messages, all of it pointed to a network far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "White Raven," he muttered again, the name a puzzle that refused to reveal its edges. Caleb's resolve hardened. He was closer than ever, but the stakes had never been higher. The network was aware of him now, and their moves would only grow more calculated. Caleb had to stay one step ahead, even if it meant walking deeper into the lion's den. He glanced at his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. Another message had arrived. "The next step is yours. Are you ready to follow?" Caleb's lips curled into a grim smile. "Always," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. He climbed back into the car, the road stretching out before him like the uncharted map of a battlefield. The hunt was far from over. The coordinates led Caleb deep into the wilderness, the paved roads giving way to gravel paths and then to nothing more than dirt tracks carved into the earth. Towering trees formed a canopy overhead, their shadows stretching across the windshield like grasping fingers. The GPS signaled that he was nearing the location, its glowing arrow pointing toward a clearing just ahead. Caleb slowed the car to a crawl, cutting the headlights as he approached the clearing. He parked under the cover of trees and stepped out into the crisp night air, his breath visible in the chill. The stillness of the forest was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. He grabbed his gear, a small pack containing his baton, a flashlight, and his phone, and began moving toward the coordinates on foot. The clearing came into view, a vast open space with an old cabin sitting at its center. The structure was weathered, its wooden planks warped and its windows clouded with grime. A faint glow emanated from within, flickering like candlelight. Caleb crouched behind a fallen log, his eyes scanning the area for signs of movement. The cabin was surrounded by silence, but it felt too perfect, too staged. As Caleb observed, he noticed a faint trail leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. It was narrow, barely visible in the moonlight, but it hinted at recent use. He decided to investigate the trail first, moving cautiously as he followed it into the darkness. The forest was dense, the trees closing in around him as the path wound deeper into the wilderness. After several minutes, the trail opened into another clearing, smaller than the first, but filled with signs of activity. Tracks from tires and boots crisscrossed the ground, and a pile of ashes suggested a recently extinguished fire. Caleb crouched to examine the tracks, his mind piecing together the scene. This was a staging area, a place where people had gathered before moving out. But where? And why? A faint sound caught Caleb's attention, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a voice, low and indistinct, coming from somewhere within the trees. He moved toward it, his steps silent as he closed the distance. The voice grew clearer, joined by another, the two engaged in a hushed conversation. Caleb stopped just short of the source, crouching low behind a thick tree. Two figures stood in the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods. One held a flashlight, its beam pointed at a map spread out on the ground. The other gestured emphatically, their tone sharp but controlled. "We don't have time for this," the first figure said, their voice carrying a hint of frustration. "The shipment's already delayed. If we don't move now, it's over." The second figure replied, their voice calmer but no less firm. "We can't risk exposure. White Raven's orders were clear. Stick to the plan." Caleb's pulse quickened. He inched closer, straining to hear more. The mention of White Raven was enough to confirm that these people were part of the network. But what was their role? And what plan were they referring to? As Caleb listened, the second figure folded the map and tucked it into their jacket. "We leave at first light," they said. "Everything needs to be in place before then." The two figures moved deeper into the woods, their voices fading into the distance. Caleb considered following them, but decided against it. The information he'd overheard was valuable, but he needed more context. He turned back toward the first clearing, his mind racing with possibilities. Back at the cabin, Caleb circled the structure, keeping to the shadows as he searched for signs of life. The faint glow from inside remained steady, but there was no movement, no indication that anyone was inside. He crept closer, his footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. Reaching the cabin's side, Caleb peered through one of the grimy windows. The interior was sparse, a single table and chair occupying the center of the room. On the table sat a lantern, its flame flickering weakly. Papers were scattered across the surface, their edges curling with age. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he focused on the papers. They were maps, detailed and marked with symbols he couldn't decipher from this distance. He moved to the door, testing the handle. It was unlocked. Caleb hesitated, his instincts warning him that this could be a trap. But the potential for information was too great to ignore. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and wax. Caleb moved to the table, his eyes scanning the maps and notes. Most were logistical: routes, drop points, and schedules. But one sheet caught his attention. It bore a symbol he recognized from the manifest. A raven, its wings spread wide. "This is bigger than I thought," Caleb muttered to himself, his voice barely audible in the stillness. He pulled out his phone, snapping photos of the documents. Each image felt like a piece of a puzzle he was just beginning to comprehend. A sudden noise outside froze Caleb in place. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, and moved to the window. Two figures emerged from the trail, their flashlights cutting through the night. Caleb ducked low, his heart pounding as he watched them approach. One of the figures spoke, their voice carrying through the still air. "The cabin's clear. Let's set up here and wait for the others." Caleb's grip tightened on his baton. He couldn't afford to be caught now, not with the information he'd gathered. He moved to the back door, slipping out silently into the night. The forest enveloped him, its shadows offering cover as he put distance between himself and the cabin. When he reached his car, Caleb's mind was racing. The network was larger and more organized than he'd imagined, and White Raven's influence stretched farther than he'd anticipated. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than he could have predicted. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed with another encrypted message. "You're closer than you realize. Keep moving." Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. He shifted the car into gear and drove off into the darkness, the road ahead filled with unanswered questions and unseen dangers. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through the darkness. Caleb gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes flicking between the GPS and the shadows beyond the windshield. The last message still burned in his mind. "You're closer than you realize. Keep moving." It was cryptic and ominous, but it only solidified his determination to see this through. The coordinates pointed toward an isolated industrial site, one Caleb hadn't seen on any maps. The closer he got, the more desolate the landscape became. He passed abandoned buildings, their windows shattered and their walls tagged with graffiti. The air seemed heavier here, laden with the weight of secrecy and decay. Caleb's car rolled to a stop at the edge of a chain-link fence. Beyond it, the industrial site loomed, a sprawling compound of warehouses, silos, and cranes that cast jagged shadows under the pale light of the moon. He killed the engine and stepped out, his movements deliberate as he surveyed the area. The gate was chained shut, but the fence had been cut in one spot, leaving an opening just wide enough for a person to slip through. Crouching low, Caleb moved through the gap, his senses on high alert. The site was eerily quiet, the hum of distant machinery barely audible above the whisper of the wind. He stuck to the shadows, weaving between rusted equipment and stacks of pallets as he made his way toward the nearest warehouse. The building loomed over him, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust. Caleb tested the side door, relieved to find it unlocked. He slipped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and decay. He activated his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of shipping containers stacked like monoliths. Caleb moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the containers for any markings. Most were unmarked, their contents a mystery, but one near the center bore a familiar symbol, a raven with its wings spread wide. His pulse quickened as he approached it. The lock was heavy-duty, but Caleb had come prepared. He retrieved a set of lock-picking tools from his bag and got to work, his fingers steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. Caleb pushed the doors apart, his flashlight illuminating the container's interior. Rows of crates filled the space, each one sealed with thick black plastic. He pulled a utility knife from his pocket and slid open one of the packages, revealing its contents: firearms, military grade, and pristine. "Just as I thought," Caleb muttered. His mind raced as he pieced together the operation. The network wasn't just smuggling. They were arming someone. Maybe multiple factions. This was bigger than drugs or contraband. It was a war chest. As Caleb documented the evidence, a sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the warehouse. Caleb extinguished his flashlight and pressed himself against the side of the container, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. They were close. Too close. "Check everything," a voice commanded, sharp and authoritative. "If he's here, I want him found." Caleb's mind raced. He hadn't expected to be discovered so soon, but the network was clearly on high alert. He moved silently, his body low to the ground as he crept toward the back of the warehouse. The shadows were his only ally now, and he used them to his advantage, weaving through the containers with practiced ease. The voices grew fainter as Caleb reached a service door. He eased it open, slipping outside into the cool night air. The compound stretched out before him, its maze of buildings and equipment offering countless places to hide or be cornered. He needed to get out, but not without more information. Caleb spotted a control tower at the far end of the site, its windows glowing faintly. If the network had a command center here, that would be it. He moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows as he made his way across the open yard. The sound of boots on concrete sent him ducking behind a stack of barrels, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Reaching the base of the tower, Caleb found a ladder bolted to its side. He climbed quickly, his muscles burning as he ascended. At the top, he paused, listening for any signs of movement inside. Hearing none, he pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The interior was cramped, filled with monitors, radios, and filing cabinets. Caleb moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers strewn across its surface. Most were logs, shipment schedules, routes, and inventories. But one document caught his attention, a roster of names, each paired with a location. "This is it," Caleb whispered, pulling out his phone to photograph the list. The names were aliases, but the locations were real, drop points scattered across the region. It was a map of the network's reach, and it was more extensive than he'd feared. As he worked, the faint hum of a radio crackled to life. A voice came through, distorted but clear enough to send a chill down Caleb's spine. "We've secured the perimeter. The target's still inside." Caleb's time was up. He pocketed his phone and slipped out of the tower, descending the ladder as quickly as he could. The yard was alive now, figures moving with purpose as they swept the area. Caleb kept low, his path zigzagging to avoid detection. He reached the fence and slipped back through the opening, his car a welcome sight in the distance. He sprinted the final stretch, his muscles screaming in protest, and dove into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life and Caleb peeled out, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as he sped away. The road ahead was empty, the headlights cutting through the darkness as Caleb's mind raced. He had what he came for, evidence that could expose the network's operations. But the danger was far from over. The network knew he was here and they wouldn't stop until they silenced him. As his phone buzzed with another message, Caleb's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. The hunt was far from over. Caleb's car sped down the deserted highway, the city lights behind him fading into the darkness. He had left the industrial site with more questions than answers, but the documents he secured gave him a glimmer of direction. A name stood out among the aliases: Foxglove. It was tied to multiple drop points and communications across the network, but there was no indication of who or what it referred to. The GPS guided him to his next destination, a mid-sized town nestled in a valley. According to his research, one of the drop points listed under Foxglove's name was an old tavern called the Rusty Nail. Caleb wasn't sure what he'd find there, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence that this location was mentioned repeatedly in the documents. As the first rays of dawn streaked across the sky, Caleb pulled into the town. It was quiet, the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. He parked a block away from the tavern, slipping a cap over his head and pulling his jacket tighter against the crisp morning air. The rusty nail was tucked into a corner of the main street, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. Caleb stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The place smelled of stale beer and wood smoke, the atmosphere heavy with a sense of abandonment. Only a few patrons were scattered across the room, nursing drinks or reading newspapers. The bartender, a wiry man with graying hair, glanced up as Caleb approached. "What can I get you?" the man asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Just coffee," Caleb replied, sliding onto a bar stool. He scanned the room casually, his gaze lingering on the shadows near the back. There was a door, partially concealed by a curtain, and a steady stream of movement behind it hinted at more activity than the quiet bar let on. As Caleb sipped his coffee, he felt a presence settle next to him. A woman in her early 30s, dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, slid onto the stool beside him. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice low but firm. "Just passing through," Caleb replied, keeping his tone casual. The woman smirked. "Funny. People who pass through don't usually order coffee at a place like this. They also don't spend so much time staring at that back door." Caleb's muscles tensed, but he forced himself to relax. "And you are?" "Someone who knows when a stranger's in over their head," she replied, leaning closer. "If you're looking for trouble, you found the right place." Before Caleb could respond, the bartender called out, "Anna, you're needed in the back." The woman, Anna, stood, her smirk turning into a knowing smile. "Enjoy your coffee," she said before disappearing through the curtain. Caleb waited for several minutes before making his move. He stood, leaving cash on the counter, and casually walked toward the back. The curtain fluttered as he pushed through, revealing a narrow hallway lit by a single bulb. The muffled sound of voices came from a room at the end of the corridor. He moved quietly, his steps barely audible against the worn floorboards. Reaching the door, he pressed his ear against it. Inside, multiple voices were engaged in a heated discussion. "We can't afford another delay," one voice said, sharp and agitated. "Foxglove's not going to wait forever." A second voice, calmer but no less insistent, replied, "If we rush, we risk exposure. We need to stay under the radar until the next shipment." Caleb's pulse quickened. He strained to hear more, but the voices dropped lower, their words indistinct. He checked the handle. Locked. Frustrated but determined, he retreated to the bar, his mind racing. As he exited, a shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Caleb turned sharply, catching a glimpse of Anna watching him from the corner of the room. Their eyes met briefly before she disappeared again, leaving him unsettled. That evening, Caleb returned to his car, his thoughts tangled. He had learned little about Foxglove, but the urgency in the voices he heard confirmed its importance. As he started the engine, a knock on his window startled him. He turned to see Anna standing outside, her expression unreadable. Caleb lowered the window slightly. "Something I can help you with?" "Yeah," she said, her tone clipped. "You're not going to get far sneaking around like that." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "And you're offering to help?" Anna glanced over her shoulder, her voice dropping. "Let's just say I don't like being kept in the dark. If you're after Foxglove, we might have a common interest." Caleb hesitated, weighing his options. Trusting a stranger in this line of work was a gamble, but Anna's knowledge of the tavern and its secrets could be invaluable. "Fine," he said, unlocking the door. "Get in." Anna slid into the passenger seat, her movements deliberate. "You're going to want to hear what I know," she said, her voice low. "And if you're smart, you'll take my advice." As Caleb drove into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a dangerous decision. Caleb didn't trust Anna, not fully, but her presence in the passenger seat added an air of unpredictability he knew he could use to his advantage. Her sharp eyes darted to the GPS screen on the dashboard, where the coordinates glowed faintly against the dim light of the car's interior. "You don't say much, do you?" Anna remarked, breaking the silence. Her tone was casual, but Caleb caught the undercurrent of curiosity. "Depends on the company," Caleb replied, keeping his focus on the road. She smirked. "Fair enough. But if we're going to work together, maybe you should tell me what you're after. Foxglove doesn't just show up in casual conversation." Caleb debated how much to reveal. Anna had already proven she knew more than she let on, but giving her too much information could backfire. "I'm after answers," he said finally. "Foxglove is a lead. That's all you need to know." Anna leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. "Suit yourself," she said, "but if you're poking around in Foxglove's business, you'd better be ready for what comes next." Caleb's jaw tightened. He was more than ready. The coordinates led them to an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. The entrance was marked by a rusted gate hanging on one hinge, the sign above it faded beyond recognition. Caleb parked the car a safe distance away, killing the engine as he surveyed the area. "This is the place?" Anna asked, her voice low. "Looks like it," Caleb replied, stepping out of the car. The night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rust. He grabbed a flashlight from the back seat and motioned for Anna to follow. The quarry stretched out before them, a vast expanse of jagged rock and overgrown vegetation. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the terrain, making every shape and movement feel like a threat. Caleb's footsteps crunched against the gravel as he led the way, his senses on high alert. They descended into the quarry, the sound of their movements swallowed by the oppressive silence. Caleb's flashlight illuminated a path through the rubble, leading toward a cluster of dilapidated buildings at the base of the pit. As they approached, Anna spoke up. "You feel that?" Caleb stopped, turning to her. "Feel what?" "The tension," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place isn't empty." Caleb nodded grimly. He had felt it too, a presence, subtle but undeniable. He motioned for Anna to stay close as they moved toward the buildings. The first structure they reached was little more than a shell, its walls crumbling and its roof partially collapsed. Caleb swept his flashlight across the interior, revealing stacks of rusted machinery and discarded tools. Nothing of interest. The second building, however, was different. The door was intact, its surface scratched and scuffed but otherwise solid. Caleb tried the handle. It was locked. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and began working on the lock, his movements precise and practiced. "You always carry that thing?" Anna asked, her tone laced with curiosity. "Comes in handy," Caleb replied, not looking up. The lock clicked open, and Caleb pushed the door ajar, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room beyond was filled with shelves lined with crates, their labels faded but still legible. Caleb stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space for anything that stood out. Anna followed, her gaze sharp as she examined the crates. "Looks like storage," she said. "But for what?" Caleb pried open one of the crates, revealing rows of small black devices. He picked one up, turning it over in his hand. "GPS trackers," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "High-grade ones." Anna frowned. Why would Foxglove need these? "Good question," Caleb muttered, placing the device back in the crate. He moved to another shelf, his flashlight catching a glint of metal. He reached out, pulling an object from the shadows. A tablet, its screen cracked but still functional. Caleb powered it on, the screen flickering to life. "What is it?" Anna asked, leaning closer. "Logs," Caleb replied, scrolling through the files. "Shipment records, locations, and names." "Names?" Anna's tone sharpened. "Of what? Clients?" "Or targets," Caleb said grimly, his mind racing. This wasn't just a storage site. It was a hub of operations, a nerve center for Foxglove's activities. A sudden noise outside made both of them freeze. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, echoed through the quarry. Caleb killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. He motioned for Anna to stay quiet as he moved to the window, peering out into the night. Figures moved through the shadows, their flashlights sweeping across the quarry floor. "We've got company," Caleb whispered. "How many?" Anna asked, her voice steady. "Too many," Caleb replied. He turned to her, his expression tense. "We need to get out of here." Anna nodded, her movements quick and efficient as she helped Caleb secure the crate they had opened. They slipped out the back of the building, their steps silent as they made their way toward the quarry's edge. The moonlight illuminated a narrow path leading to higher ground. Caleb motioned for Anna to follow, his eyes darting between the shadows as they ascended. The figures below hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. When they reached the top, Caleb glanced back at the quarry. The lights below moved in chaotic patterns, the search intensifying. Whatever Foxglove was protecting here, it was enough to warrant a small army. He tightened his grip on the tablet, his mind already working through the implications of what he had found. "Let's go," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. Together, they disappeared into the night, the tablet and its secrets safely in Caleb's grasp. The air was crisp and biting as Caleb exited the car, his boots crunching against the gravel road. The coordinates from the tablet had led him to a remote farmstead at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place that wouldn't draw attention unless someone was looking for it. The barn ahead was weathered but sturdy, its faded red paint barely visible under a thin coating of frost. Anna climbed out of the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the landscape with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "I don't like this," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Too quiet. Too perfect." Caleb nodded. He felt it too. Places like this were rarely as innocent as they seemed. He adjusted the strap of his bag and moved toward the barn, his every step deliberate. Anna followed closely, her hand resting near the concealed weapon on her belt. The barn door groaned as Caleb pushed it open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with farming equipment and stacks of hay. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rust. Caleb scanned the space, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. "This can't be it," Anna muttered, her tone skeptical. "Foxglove doesn't seem like the farming type." Caleb ignored her, moving deeper into the barn. His instincts told him there was more to this place. Near the back, he spotted a section of the floor that looked different. Newer wood, slightly raised. He crouched down, running his fingers along the edges until he found a hidden latch. "Help me with this," he said, glancing at Anna. She stepped forward, gripping the latch with him. Together, they lifted the panel, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Caleb exchanged a look with Anna before pulling out his flashlight. "Stay close," he said. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the hidden basement. The temperature dropped noticeably and the air grew damp. At the bottom, they found themselves in a narrow hallway, the walls lined with exposed concrete. A faint hum of electricity echoed through the space, growing louder with every step. The hallway opened into a larger room, illuminated by rows of fluorescent lights. Caleb's breath caught as he took in the sight before him. Tables lined the walls, covered with computers, monitors, and stacks of documents. In the center of the room was a map, its surface marked with pins and strings connecting various locations. Foxglove's operations laid bare. Anna whistled low. "Well, this is something," she said, stepping closer to the map. Her eyes scanned the connections, lingering on a cluster of pins near the coast. "Looks like they've been busy." Caleb moved to one of the tables, rifling through the documents. Most were coded, but a few were in plain text, lists of shipments, names, and destinations. He took photos of everything, his mind racing as he pieced together the scope of the network. "This isn't just a local operation," he said. "It's global." Anna nodded, her expression grim. "And well-funded." As they worked, a sound from the hallway made them both freeze. The faint clatter of boots against the concrete sent a jolt of adrenaline through Caleb. He motioned for Anna to turn off the lights. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the electronics the only sound. They crouched behind one of the tables, their breaths shallow as the footsteps drew closer. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. Caleb gripped his baton tightly, ready to strike if necessary. Beside him, Anna's hand hovered near her holster. The beam paused on the map, illuminating the tangled web of connections. A voice broke the silence. "They've been here. Get the others." The footsteps retreated, the sound fading down the hallway. Caleb let out a quiet breath, his mind racing. They had to move. Fast. "We're blown," Anna whispered. "We need to get out of here." "Not yet," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "There's more we need." He moved quickly to the computers, plugging in a small device to one of the USB ports. A progress bar appeared on the screen, data streaming onto the drive. Caleb watched it intently, willing it to move faster. Anna paced near the door, her eyes darting between the hallway and Caleb. "They'll be back any second." "Almost there," Caleb said, his tone clipped. The progress bar reached 100% and Caleb yanked the drive from the computer. "Let's go." They moved through the hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights guiding their way. The sound of voices grew louder, their pursuers closing in. Caleb led Anna toward a second staircase, this one leading to the far side of the barn. As they emerged into the open air, the chill hit them like a wall. Caleb scanned the area, his eyes adjusting to the moonlight. The faint hum of a vehicle engine caught his attention, and he motioned for Anna to follow him toward the tree line. They slipped into the forest, the shadows swallowing them as they moved deeper into the trees. The sound of the engine grew louder, headlights cutting through the darkness as their pursuers searched the area. Caleb's heart pounded, but he kept his steps silent, his focus unrelenting. When they were a safe distance from the farmstead, Caleb stopped, catching his breath. Anna leaned against a tree, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, her voice low, "that was close." "Too close," Caleb replied, his jaw tight. He held up the USB drive. "But we've got what we need." Anna nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Let's hope it's worth it." As they disappeared deeper into the forest, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that their discovery was no accident. Foxglove was watching, and their next move would be even more dangerous. The tension in the motel room was almost tangible, an oppressive weight pressing down on Caleb as he hunched over his laptop. The USB drive, no larger than a thumb, sat plugged into the port, a small but potent symbol of the secrets it contained. Across from him, Anna perched on a wobbly chair, her arms crossed, her piercing gaze cutting through the dim light. "You've been staring at that thing for hours," she said, breaking the silence. "What's the plan?" Caleb didn't glance up. His fingers tapped steadily on the keyboard, lines of code scrolling across the screen. "The plan," he replied, his voice measured, "is to crack these files and figure out where Foxglove is hiding." Anna leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight. "And you think you can?" Caleb's lips twitched in a fleeting smile. "I've done this before." "Good, because every second you're cracking code, they're moving." Her voice carried a note of urgency that Caleb didn't miss. Hours stretched into the night, the room filled with the rhythmic tapping of keys and the occasional rustle of papers as Anna flipped through the hard copies they had taken from the barn. Caleb's concentration was unwavering, his brow furrowed in determination. The first glimmers of dawn were breaking when Caleb finally leaned back, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "Got it." Anna was at his side in an instant. "What are we looking at?" Caleb turned the laptop toward her. The decrypted files displayed a series of coordinates and container codes. "There's a shipment," he explained. "Tomorrow night. A major one. East Coast port." Anna frowned as she scanned the information. "This is big." "It has to be," Caleb said. "Look at the encryption levels. They wouldn't go to these lengths for a standard shipment." "But what if it's a trap?" she countered. "Then we spring it," Caleb replied. "On our terms." Anna hesitated before nodding. All right, let's plan. The port was a sprawling expanse of shipping containers, towering cranes, and industrial warehouses. Floodlights bathed the area in harsh, artificial light, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the guards. Caleb and Anna parked on a hill overlooking the scene, their binoculars trained on the activity below. "Security's tight," Anna remarked. "This isn't a routine operation." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on a cluster of figures near the docks. Their movements were sharp and coordinated. "That's them," he said. "Foxglove's team." Anna handed him a thermos of coffee. "So, what's the plan? Sneak in and hope we find the container before they spot us?" "Not exactly." Caleb spread a map of the port across the dashboard. "We'll create a diversion here. It'll draw their attention while I find the container." Anna smirked. "And I'm the diversion, I take it?" "You're good at it," Caleb replied, his tone light despite the tension. Anna chuckled. "Flattery will get you nowhere, but fine. Let's make some noise." Anna moved through the shadows with practiced ease, planting small explosive charges near fuel drums and storage sheds. Caleb watched from a distance, his heart pounding as he prepared to infiltrate the shipping lanes. The first explosion tore through the night, a brilliant flash followed by a deafening roar. Alarms blared, and guards scrambled toward the chaos. Caleb seized the opportunity. Moving quickly and silently, he slipped past the commotion and into the maze of containers. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he scanned the codes painted on the metal. Time stretched thin, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, he found it. A rust-streaked container marked with the code from the files. Caleb pried it open with a crowbar, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, rows of crates were stacked neatly, their labels bearing a familiar Raven insignia. Caleb opened the first crate, his breath hitching at the sight of military-grade weapons, rifles, grenades, tactical gear. Everything was pristine, polished, and ready for deployment. He snapped photos with his phone, documenting the evidence before moving to the next crate. The second crate was different. It contained communication devices, encrypted laptops, and stacks of sealed documents. Caleb's mind raced as he pieced it together. "This isn't just arms dealing," he muttered. "This is infrastructure. They're planning something bigger." A crackle from a nearby radio shattered the silence. "Sector 5, report in. Possible breach." Caleb's stomach tightened. The diversion had bought him time, but it was running out. He secured the crates and slipped back into the shadows. Anna was waiting near the car, her face flushed with adrenaline. "You took your sweet time," she said as Caleb slid into the passenger seat. "They're on to us," Caleb replied, his voice tight. "We need to move." Anna didn't need to be told twice. She slammed the car into gear, the tires screeching as they sped away. In the rearview mirror, Caleb watched the port shrink into the distance, the glow of the fires Anna had set still visible against the dark horizon. "They're not just moving weapons," Caleb said grimly. "They're orchestrating something massive." Anna glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "And now we're in the middle of it." Caleb nodded. "Which means we're getting closer. We can't stop now." The night air was cold as Caleb and Anna stood at the edge of the dense forest, their eyes fixed on the imposing research lab nestled in the mountains. The facility was heavily fortified, surrounded by towering fences and patrolled by armed guards. Floodlights swept the grounds, making it nearly impossible to approach unnoticed. "This is it," Caleb said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "If we don't stop them here, Foxglove wins." Anna adjusted her tactical vest, her expression hardening. "We've come this far. No turning back now." The two had spent the last hours planning their infiltration. They knew it was a long shot, but the intelligence they had gathered from the safe house and the man who claimed to be their ally painted a grim picture. Foxglove wasn't just running arms. Their lab housed a prototype bioweapon capable of global devastation. Under the cover of darkness, Caleb and Anna began their approach. Using the dense tree line as cover, they made their way to a blind spot in the patrol's rotation. Caleb worked quickly, disabling the security cameras with a device he had built from salvaged parts. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Done," he whispered. "We've got 10 minutes before they notice." Anna gave him a curt nod, leading the way through the fence they had cut earlier. The two moved swiftly, their steps soundless on the damp grass. The facility loomed larger with every step, its sterile walls hiding the horrors within. Once inside, the stark white corridors of the lab stretched endlessly. Caleb's heart raced as they moved deeper, following the map the man had provided. Every corner they turned felt like a potential ambush, every sound a threat. In one of the rooms, they found a storage area filled with canisters marked with biohazard symbols. Caleb's stomach turned. "This is it," he said. "They're stockpiling for deployment." Anna inspected the labels, her jaw tightening. "We have to destroy this." Before they could act, the sound of boots echoed down the corridor. Caleb and Anna pressed themselves against the wall, their weapons drawn. The guards passed by, their conversation indicating they were unaware of the intrusion. For now. "Let's keep moving," Anna whispered. At the heart of the lab, they found a massive control room. Screens displayed maps of major cities along with data streams and countdown timers. Standing in the center was a figure Caleb recognized from the files they had uncovered, Foxglove's leader. "So, you're the ones causing all this trouble," the leader said, his voice calm yet menacing. He turned to face them, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the monitors. "I have to admit, you've been impressive." "Shut it down," Anna demanded, her gun trained on him. The leader chuckled. "Do you really think it's that simple? This isn't just a lab. It's the future." Caleb stepped forward. "The future you're planning will kill millions." "Sacrifices are necessary for progress," the leader said, unflinching. He pressed a button on the console, triggering an alarm. "But you won't be alive to see it." Guards poured into the room, their weapons raised. Chaos erupted as Caleb and Anna fought back, using the consoles and equipment for cover. The gunfire was deafening, but the two moved with precision, their training and determination driving them forward. As the last guard fell, Caleb raced to the control panel, his fingers flying across the keys. "I can overload the system," he said, his voice strained. "But we need to get out, fast." Anna covered him, her eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. "How long?" 2 minutes, Caleb replied. "Maybe less." The leader, injured but conscious, laughed weakly from where he lay on the floor. "You think destroying this lab will stop us? Foxglove is everywhere." Anna silenced him with a sharp glare. "Not if we expose you." With the system set to self-destruct, Caleb and Anna sprinted through the corridors, the alarms blaring louder with each passing second. The building shook as the explosion began from the core, flames licking at their heels as they barely made it out. From a safe distance, they watched as the lab was engulfed in flames, the once imposing structure reduced to rubble. Caleb leaned against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over," he said, though the words felt hollow. "For now," Anna replied. Her tone was weary, but her eyes held a spark of resolve. "But Foxglove isn't done. We have their files, their names. This was just the beginning." Caleb nodded. The fight wasn't over, but they had struck a critical blow. Together, they walked back into the darkness, ready for whatever came next.